opposition, UT Mara 2. Closing government, University of Philippines, Jilamar 1. And closing opposition, IIUM 1. So, my name is Vincent. I'll be the chair for today. To my left is my panelist, Avi. To my right is my panelist, Ride. Really quickly, to simplify the pronoun introductions, I guess, just for the sake of this widely populated audience debate, is everyone all right if we refer to people using gender-neutral pronouns for this debate broadly?
Our pronouns also.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone, would anyone like to specify a particular gender pronoun? No. All right. Sorry, just cutting it through there. Without much further ado, then, I invite the Prime Minister to speak in the motion that bears their name. Here.
Mr. Speaker, in various areas of society, we manage to mobilize women and allow them equality. And for example, when it comes to employment, when it comes to political mobility, when it comes to sports, even in relationships, we somehow managed to find out policy mechanisms and other means in which you can consider them to be equal. However, the one area which has led to us being stuck in that objective is the fundamental difference that still remains between men and women. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is sexuality. And we believe that is a core problem we need to tackle in order to truly fight gender inequality. So here's the thing. Currently, it's perceived that only women can be sexualized, men at any point in time cannot. It's considered that only women are the ones used in, for example, advertisements or in pop songs to be sexual entities in order to either advertise something or to promote that sexuality, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that's the fundamental difference that still makes people believe that the only job that women can do and the biggest characteristic of a woman is how she looks, what her appearance should be. And that's the fundamental problem, which is why other skills that she might have are undermined constantly. And that's the fight that we, from opening government, want to resolve. What I'll be doing in my speech is fundamentally three things. First, the nature of sexualization and a comparison between the kinds that happen on men right now. I'll then talk about the problem, please talk about the change process in which it happens, right? But before that, what do we mean aggressively sexualize? We mean that men will not just be sexualized, but it will be as bizarre when gigantic boobs are shown in burger commercials in Japan, where they have nothing to do with burgers, right? That's the extent of aggressive sexualization that we want to promote under our model, right? So first, we believe, ladies and gentlemen, that at this point in time, the nature of sexualization has three folds. Number one, it's bizarre, as I explained already, and often out of context, just to attract attention on the women in the first place. Listen up. But secondly, more often than not, ladies and gentlemen, we see that whenever women are sexualized, they play a secondary role as well, which is generally subservient to men. That means they're trying to feed the demand of a man, even if it's not related, just to feed them. For example, Ferraris and most cars are designed to be marketed towards women, towards men, and to do that, you put a hot chick beside the car, ladies and gentlemen. So it's actually subservient directly to women. But thirdly, in Japan, we think that even when men are sexualized, it's generally attached to a lot of other characteristics. For example, Harvey Specter in Suits, right? Even if he's this really sexy character whose biceps are there and whatnot, he's still considered somebody who's good at law at the same time. So the nature in which men are sexualized is significantly different as well. But we further believe that it happens in much less extreme as well in Japan. It's far less in society. Having said that, sexualization is extremely damaging for women for a number of reasons. Number one, it reduces them to appearance. Whatever other skills they might have become less relevant in comparison to that one overarching characteristic that makes sure that those things cannot be considered. But here's the thing, please sit down. Why is it particularly problematic if it's only for women that only women are sexualized? Because then it becomes please sit down. Then it becomes a gender issue altogether in Japan. It's no longer about whether sexualization should be there or not, but it's about women being sexualized. What does this do? First, women who are naturally born as attractive try to keep it that way because they fear that removing that would lead to them losing their position in society, whether it comes to jobs and whatnot. Before we move on, yeah.
Given that men are often made comfortable about their sexuality versus a woman, how does your policy envision and change the way in which we fight for gender equality?
We think that at the end of the day, as I'll prove to you later on, is we want sexualization at worst to be at least gender neutral in Jetman, instead of just one particular sex being sexualized over and over again, because that's particularly harmful. What happens then in Jetman is that women who aren't as attractive feel that they need to do that in order for any social mobility or any political mobility to be there. Even for getting a job in Jetman, they feel that it's important that not only are they good at accounting and whatnot, they need to look good as well. They need to make sure that they wear sexual clothes at the end of the day. And in most cases, this is extremely harmful because it adds pressure on the women all throughout their life in Jetman, which is extremely bad for them. We believe in Jetman. At the end of the day, we think sexualization is definitely harmful, especially when it's just for women in Jetman. What do we do under our model? We first believe that, as I explained earlier, the current mentality is that sexuality is a female monopoly. What happens when you overly sexualize men? First, when you do, we probably realize how ridiculous it really is, right? I mean, imagine me flashing my boobs and putting whipped cream all over it just to advertise pancakes, right? I know I'm not sexy, but point is, if somebody was, that would be extremely ridiculous in Jetman. And that's extremely important to point out. Because in Jetman, in order for you to present a strong counter narrative, it needs to be strong in the first place, so that you can actually point out how ridiculous the current form of sexualization is. Therefore, in Jetman, the first discourse to create is by pointing out the problem in Jetman. That can only be done when you're being overly aggressive at the end of the day. So there are two groups of men we're going to talk about today. The first are men who actually like this, right? Or women actually like this. We think if men are comfortable with being sexualized, what is the impact of that? The impact is that at least sexualization becomes gender neutral. It becomes an individual expression that both men and women can do without being framed to be specific to one particular gender in Japan. In that case, women aren't specifically targeted and sexualized, and it can be something that as a form of individual expression of both men and women. But the bigger question to Lynn Jetman is about men who will not be liking this, because there will be quite a few Lynn Jetman. What happens then is that at the very least, they'll start engaging and discussing in this particular issue, right? Because I was extremely offended by that particular video. It was disgusting. But then, ladies and gentlemen, the next time they see a woman doing exactly that, it would also raise a question of whether that's okay too. Because that's exactly what he saw Brad Pitt doing a second ago. It should not be okay when Angelina Jolie does the same thing 5 minutes later in Japan in a different commercial. We believe that contrast needs to exist for any discussion to take place in the first place in Japan. Because unless you can show that contrast between men and women, we think you can never reach a discourse where men themselves can realize how ridiculous this is and how it's absolutely offensive and degrading to women in Japan. But here's the last part in Japan. We think that in more often than not, the reason why men tend to sexualize women is because they haven't been exposed to anything else in Japan. Because all their lives as they grew up, starting from television commercials to movies to TV shows to billboards to kids shows for that matter in Japan, sexualization of women have been something that they went through in Japan. I mean, Goku's wife had to be hot when I was 9 years old in Japan. As a result, that's the only exposure that a child and that a male child ever receives. It's important to provide a different exposure, an alternative narrative, so he or she can realize that not only sexualization in Japan, but more importantly, why the overtly aggressive versions of it is actually extremely offensive. You need to provide them with that common ground, because right now that doesn't exist, where you can provide a comparative with what if that was you? What if that woman who's showing her boobs in front of a car was you instead in Japan? And that difference is extremely important. As a result of that, we believe that this is the only thing that we need to solve, and the last thing we need to solve to really reach a world that's gender equal in Japan. And for that objective, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister. Invite the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Featuring. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, men endure pain as an undeserved punishment. Women accept pain as a natural heritage. All the emotional, sexual, and psychological stereotype that female face begins at the point in which the doctor lays that baby in your hand and says, "Congratulations, it's a girl." The way in which opening opposition will argue in this debate, in how we best strategically engage in the fight for gender equality, is how we best evaluate the value of sexuality, as well as the method of aggressively sexualizing men. And we will argue that there's no impact to that particular policy. Moreover, we will argue that it makes it a lot worse, because the conflation then becomes the fight for gender equality is often convoluted with the message of sexuality, and it ends there, Mr. Speaker. We think that's problematic. So this debate is about how we best strategically engage with the communities that we will talk about in terms of how we fight for gender equality. We are against all methods of aggressively sexualizing individuals in status quo. We argue that sexualization is a value to the individual in the way in which they characterize what sexuality means, but we think that the way in which media approaches the method of aggressively sexualizing individuals is problematic. We agree. We don't want to see his boobs, Mr. Speaker. So we reject the notion on opening government that only women can be sexualized in status quo. We think that both genders can, but the way in which the media aggressively portray sexuality is often tied to gender binaries as well as gender expectations as to how they're supposed to act. I'll talk about this a lot more later. Secondly, the standard that they employ in this debate is that when you aggressively sexualize people, it is a bizarre thing, and we think that that's problematic. It is unclear because the Prime Minister was not able to illustrate what it means to bizarrely aggressively sexualize a man, but can succinctly describe what it means for that. There is a clear delineation and explicit standard that you employ onto how you sexualize women, and there is none on men, Mr. Speaker. We think, then how do you then transition into a world that is gender neutral? There was no ability for this argument to be concretized or grounded. Lastly, if sexualization is really a value on the that side of the house and they were very willing to fight for it, we think that why don't they just engage in a world in which they tell women to hijack and own sexuality, Mr. Speaker? Why is it that women have to be faulted in the way in which society views them and tell them that this value is something that ought to be gender neutral and something that you should be proud of? We think it's problematic for that side of the house. Let's move on to opening opposition. I will clash largely with government in this debate. So firstly, what does aggressively sexualizing mean in status quo, Mr. Speaker? We think that this is when the media is able to portray in an overtly scandalous manner, but especially for women, right? It's not just about purely or merely celebrating your sexuality. The way in which rhetoric is built in status quo is that it is often conflated to presuppose gender binaries in how females are supposed to act. So it's not just scandalous depiction of women, but an attachment that because you are from a weaker spectrum, it creates a conceptualization that you are a prey, that people are supposed to look at you this way because that is your role in society, Mr. Speaker. We think that this particular rhetoric does not apply to men. How so? We agree that in some instances you can sexualize men, but because the notion of masculinity often exists in the way in which we portray men, we think it becomes a lot more problematic because people don't view this particular position as being a victim or as being a prey, but more likely an alpha that is owning his body, Mr. Speaker. We secondly argue that there is a standard that you set in terms of the beauty as well as the sexualization that exists under that particular policy. That is why people like Sadiq or Mitra or even you, Vincent, often get sexualized in the media because it constitutes that standard of what it means to be successfully sexualized in that regard. That is why people who are unattractive in nature, like Hafiz, God knows, right, will never be portrayed in media the same way because there is no ability for some benefit to materialize. So on face, we will argue that the act of aggressively sexualizing is a liability in and of itself. But here's where we ground the debate in real world impacts, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, we will argue, and I alluded to this in my point of information, men are often bred in a world in which they are told that they ought to feel comfortable in their sexual identity because it's something that they own, because it's an inherent right to them. But we think and we argue that women are often shamed in taking actions that propagate their sexuality as well as how they approach their identities, Mr. Speaker. That means that you don't eliminate the notion of gender inequality in this particular regard because the ability for females to own their sexuality is often in a convoluted manner and attached to so much shame in comparative to men feeling proud, coming out and owning their sexuality, something Mifzal will be very happy to do every single day. The comparison then exists in the media, Mr. Speaker, in illustration. Things like having a dad bod or a man bun or a beer belly is a legitimate option of you of how you portray your aesthetic appeal in status quo, because you're owning your identity irrespective of what society tells you. But for women, it is particularly pernicious because the ability of being whatever size I want to be is often tied to things like fat shaming, especially in the media. And you are told that just because you don't look like a Victoria's Secret model, you are an invaluable person in society, Mr. Speaker. This is problematic because we think that you legitimize the different categorization of standards in how we treat them. Before I move on to why you legitimize the act of men in claiming it's fair game and how you conflate the fight, Leomar.
That's exactly the point. How can women ever own their sexuality if the message is still insofar as men push that sexuality onto them?
Okay, the presumption that exists in society in general is that that's what you're supposed to be, and we think the media offers incentive to capitalize on this because they want to ensure some degree of appeal exists in their media, Mr. Speaker, right? And we think that distinction comes at the point in which you are told in society how you are supposed to be comfortable in how you are. Secondly, we argue you legitimize the act of men in aggressively sexualizing women because they can now claim it is fair game. It makes it a lot harder for the discourse because people who are moderate in nature can't rely on the argumentation that this is problematic because people can counterclaim and say, but you are doing the same thing to men as well. And it's far worse because the ability for a person to feel comfortable in fighting in this fight is important because they need to provide valuable counter-narrative. But thirdly, you signal to extreme bigots that now it's a fair game for all because you are also subjected that particular way, but worse because you're also shaming women. Lastly, we think it conflates and dilutes the focus for the fight for gender equality. We argue that gender equality needs to transcend beyond things like your ability to self-actualize and owning your sexuality to things like being able to achieve political mobility as well as economic mobility as well as social recognition, Mr. Speaker. At the point in which you confuse this fight and attach an attachment to overtly sexualizing individuals and saying that this is the best way in which we fight for gender equality, we think that the message that you send is that the fight is solely based on this and the ability for us to move forward is dependent on how we sexualize people. We think that's problematic because people can't move beyond that. We speak for men and women who do not speak for those who don't have a voice because they are terrified of the standards as well as the positions that exist in society. Opening up is proud to open this debate on all.
Thankfully, invite here.
All the issues that Jenna talks about when it comes to women feeling insecure about their body, etc., is the status quo. When she tells us that women's sexuality will somehow change and they're not being able to own it because we are doing this, that is absolutely untrue. Currently, and deal with this, is the status quo is as such that the past discrepancy towards women has been there. This means the ubiquity of the sexualization of women has always been there. Women are currently facing the same problems that you claim them to be facing. So the relation then has to be why aggressively sexualizing women carries on with that. They say two things. One, they presuppose that automatically, because you have different ways of sexualizing men and women, you will never really see men as anything other than masculine, etc. As Tosef has already told you, the only way in which that happens is if you're doing it in a different, if you're portraying men as masculine. In a scenario where you aggressively sexualize men, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a masculine manner. When you make them wear pink undies and pull out, that is when you can add the addition of feminized sexualization of men. We don't think it necessarily has to be a masculine way of bringing it out, but you can also bring out a feminine way. So we don't think why this is mutually exclusive. If anything, in our model, it's easier to sexualize men and then show that you don't have to adhere to being masculine or to being feminine. You can be both and either way. You can show women doing heavy-hefted jobs in a sexy manner. Similarly, men washing your clothes in a sexy manner. We think this kind of diversity can only be brought about if we sexualize men. The exact reason why Jenna said, right? The mentality currently exists that men cannot be sexualized without making it masculine. It's untrue, and that can be possible only if you allow this to happen. The second thing that they say is men are already comfortable with sexuality. After you pass this motion, women become more uncomfortable with sexuality. We say two things. One, if currently women are already uncomfortable with their sexuality, we say this can only be one of the basic reasons for this is simply because they're the only one who are massively sexualized. What does this mean? This means that they don't see a platform where men are being sexualized, which means they're forced to be sexualized in most cases compared to the other gender. This means that body shaming only happens for women and not for men. We say that in these circumstances, when you sexualize men, the possibility of body shaming happening both is there. We understand. However, we're willing to say that they both happen, and this is not based on a certain gender. That when Victoria's Secret models are thin, the comparison is that likely motorcycle models who are men will also have to be thin or also have to be lean, etc. So we don't see why this is significantly changing the inequality purpose that you talk about. The only thing that then becomes relevant is whether you legitimize bigots who come to sexualize women more. We say bigots who already sexualize women do not essentially need an excuse to sexualize women, even if this carries on as an excuse to sexualize women. We say that you cannot in this society. The alternative then, or the counterfactual then, is trying to remove sexualization of women overall, to which they say we're okay with owning sexuality. Here is when I'll talk about women on an individual level. When you do not pass this motion under current scenario, amount of pressure that they face only for being women and only for being sexual. But before I move on, Jay.
Your case is hinged on the premise that we don't only sexualize men in status quo. I told you in my speech, there is a distinction between how we treat sexuality and comfort.
Sure.
How does aggressively amplifying this make the discussion better?
Exactly. Sexualization of men currently is on, etc. We agree. However, extreme and aggressive sexualization on all platforms in which women are sexualized brings out, and as Tausif has put forward, ridiculousness of the idea of heavily sexualizing women as heavily this was completely the way to extreme sexualization of men is what brings about the impact of understanding the sheer comedy of the scenario that there is. But then what happens? What happens to women when they come up? Ladies and gentlemen, under the current scenario, while we understand that women are facing a lot of issues, one of the biggest issues that they face is for men. The biggest problem with sexualization of women today is it's done for men. And the concept is very harmful for the woman who is now growing up to be what they want to be. And the unfortunate part is that aim becomes for men. When you gender neutral or when you make sexualization something that's dual, if anything, if you will be proud of owning your sexuality only because other gender is doing the same. But if anything, the reduction of sexualizing yourself for men only reduces, simply because sexualization then is no longer an implied version of gender role. This means only women are not expected to sexualize themselves. We are okay if as an expression on an individual, you're sexualizing yourself or for your satisfaction. And we think this is only done through our model if you come forward and show the world the counterfactual that men can also be sexualized in a feminine or a masculine way, whichever way fits the bottle. But most importantly, talk about the women who right now feel awful. And this is where we come to a comparative with the opposition. While they come and say these things may be harmful, they never give us a way in which we can remove the sexualization of women under their model. So we agree the necessity to remove the stigma to price themselves without telling us what, but most journalists importantly innocent become them sexual. When men become sexualized, that is done for women. If anything, if they claim that is. If anything, that empowers women into thinking that they're not the only ones who have to change. But if anything, it also shows that genders don't have to change for each other. They can move forward as what they are. This means women are no longer seen as the ones who always have to change, but that men also have to look after themselves to ensure their liberty. In both scenarios, we cater to mentalities of human beings who, one, in these three paradigms, are people who will always be extreme bigots, who will take anything to legitimize sexualization. We think this is not the motion about those people. This motion is about those moderates who are growing up, seeing those sexualization of women and who need a counterfactual. You try and turn the clock and tell me that sexualization of women never took place, I'd love to remove this motion. But in a scenario where it did take place, where human beings are already infested with the idea that only women can be sexualized, we need to create a counter narrative where men can be sexualized, where independence of sexualization is not dependent on your gender, but on how you feel about it. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
There is an old saying that being a woman is difficult as it principally involves dealing with men. And we on side of opposition believe it's nothing with regards to the liberation of women has to be ran in tandem with men. And we think that this very motion only shows that the only way for women to achieve some form of equality is that we show that men can be portrayed in the same light. And we do not think that that is a way to fight for gender equality. We're proud to stand outside opening opposition. So in my speech, I'll do two things. I'll do three things. Firstly, I'll deal with the technical issues of side government, opening government, and why necessarily they didn't necessarily deal with the main issue of the debate. Secondly, I'll talk about whether or not their policy really changes anything in status quo. And lastly, I'll deal with the idea and notions of sexuality and how it will affect the discussions with regards to gender equality. Firstly, let's deal with the technical issues on side opening government. Because if you really listen to both Tausif's and Wasifa's speech, you did not notice any distinction or nuance with regards to over-sexualization of these men. Therefore, any discourse and any discussion with regards to gender equality that they wanted to fight for is also served by just notions of sexualizing men and women that already occur in status quo. Therefore, any discussion with regards to a man being able to be sexualized is already done by a woman when she sees David Beckham's junk Photoshop in his new H&M ad, Mr. Speaker. So we think that in this we think in this instances, whatever discourse that you have is not necessarily affected on your side. But secondly, we think that they also ignored a massive stakeholder in this debate, which is the media. Because if they are only going to rely on notions that this sort of overt sexualization is ridiculous and funny in nature, they didn't necessarily how the media has the pernicious incentive to make sure that those sort of ridiculous notions translates into how we perceive men and women. Therefore, that's why advertising is for. The reason why you go for like this pancake house is because you saw boobs on that advertisement. Therefore, you translate it as big boobs being something that is desirable and sexual, and I want to take advantage of that. That is the sort of perverse incentive that the media has, and we think that people don't necessarily rationalize it immediately, saying that, oh, it's just ridiculous. More often than not, the way they see these sort of messages is that, look, it is sexual. It is something I want to. It is something I want in an individual sense. It is primal. It is something that I will chase, and therefore it translates into my actions. The same result cannot be achieved when you overtly sexualize men. Why? Because men already control some form of, and they feel confident with their own sexuality and their own body. Therefore, you see notions of things like having a lot of chest hair, or having a dad bod, like Jay said, or having a beer belly. We sort of own this sort of we sort of own these sort of ideas, and it makes it seem desirable that we are the alpha if we have these sort of notions. None of their responses were tailored to this, and this is harmful. Why? Because the moment that this sort of overt sexualization happens in the media, the effect that you wanted to create, that men would somehow feel embarrassed, that women would now feel that men are not, like, that men do not belong, or that men will be embarrassed with regards to that sexualization, does not occur. In fact, women will become even more conservative, or women will become even more shy, because men already own that rhetoric, and men already feel like, look, I own my sexuality. What is your problem right now with me? That already happens in status quo with even the normal levels of sexualization we've already talked about. So on the level of whether or not they've proven whether an overt visceral effect of sexualization has an effect on the discourse that you're going to create, they have not proven why that would happen on their side. Secondly, let's talk about how whether or not this will change anything. Sit down. I've already discussed to you how necessarily these sort of sexualizations will be portrayed, and how it will affect the males in the male individuals, right? We don't think that, given the sort of fight that the gender equality movement faces with regards to things like limited capital and things like breaking down slow patriarchal structures that already happen in society, it is desirable for you to break this sort of structures by using the notion of sexuality. Why is this? Because firstly, we do not think that it is necessary for you to use notions of sexuality discourse, especially when it does not change anything, because you can highlight problems just by looking at the regular sort of sexualization we have in status quo without needing to show that men have to be sexualized even further. But secondly, and even more harmful, is that men can hijack the narrative of this discourse. So in status quo, when you say the moment you overtly sexualize yourself, there is a discussion that happens with regards to things like victim blaming in rape cases, that the only reason you were raped is because you were dressed skimpily. But in this notion, if a man can overtly sexualize himself and still portray himself to be the alpha and the controlling factor, then they will hijack it to say that, look, I sexualize myself, why is it such a problem for you now? We think that you empower that sort of narrative on their side, and they can immediately hijack those sort of discussions, especially when you're dealing with an already patriarchal structure. But before I move on, I'll take opening.
So you claim that there's this extreme sexualization that exists within the patriarchal structure without bringing a counter narrative of why either this is ridiculous or can happen for both men and women. How do you plan on changing this, not by just technical words such as social instincts?
Look, if you listen to Jay's speech, we already know that sexualization on some level already happens, right? We are against the overt sexualization of men and women by showing that it is ridiculous for you to be sexualized in that nature. I'll tell you further in my third issue why women will now be able to own the narrative of their own sexuality. Further harmful when you convolute discussions with regards to gender equality with things like sexuality, right? So more often than not, it often puts up a barrier that your discussion for gender equality will only reach insofar that you talk about your sexuality, and we think that is harmful, especially with regards to things like whether or not you own that your sexual identity or not. If you can't move past that discussion, then there is no further discourse on things like gender equality. Lastly, let's talk about why women will own their sexuality better in this instance. We think with regards to sexuality, we do not believe that it should be a gender neutral issue, right? In status quo, where you already accept the ideas of a woman being able to forward her views or being able to forward herself in a career by using things like her sexuality, we think the moment you place this sort of standards on men, therefore you already neutralize that form of ability for a woman to sort of gain some form of advantage with regards to her sexuality right now. The moment you use that platform, you equalize that platform, you already rid and you already show women that your fight for sexuality did not begin much, because we could have done it too. I've never been prouder to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and invite to commence closing half the Member of Government. Yeah.
We find it extremely strange that people would become outraged when someone writes a column about Obama's glistening pecs, but people are perfectly fine with Amal Alamuddin, a human rights lawyer, being reduced to her looks. This is not because of the notion that it's a gendered issue in status quo, but it's because men right now have the monopoly of being able to project their identities. They can separate space from the non-sexual space. Obama can say, I'm a statesman, you can't sexualize me, but women unfortunately do not have that liberty. What this debate does not have so far is a question as to what the struggle against gender inequality looks like. We from Closing Government would propose an engagement with two of the most difficult fronts in the struggle against gender inequality. One, infighting within women themselves, insofar as the body politic, for example, of women, conservatives versus liberals. And second, bringing the fight to non-gender issues, like political issues, for instance. And I would say this is the best way to be able to expose the political is personal, and we're going to engage there. We do agree with opening opposition that to a certain extent, some level of sexualization already happens. But this is where we want to contest the notion of aggressive sexualization. We can debate all day about whether or not making boobs size 50 or making balls look like they are wrecking balls, right? But we say the more likely case about aggressive sexualization is not in the form, but it's in the spaces that you try to dominate. Aggressive sexualization is in bringing sexualization to spaces which are not innately sexual and bringing out the sexuality in there. That's why a human rights lawyer, for instance, exposing the very sexuality in a human rights lawyer is considered, a female human rights lawyer is considered fine, but the moment you do it to a male human rights lawyer or a male statesman, it's considered to be bad. Few responses before that extension. First, I want to respond to the imbalance in sexuality and expression, which is one of the main cases of opening opposition. We'd say the main problem with this argument is that it relies on there being only one group of women that we are being, all men are own their body and are perfectly body, which is indicative of the harmony of over-sexuality that we are defending against coming from government bench. One, it's obviously not true. For that argument to fly, it literally has to say that all men are proud of their body, all men can own a dad bod, all men can own their glistening pecs within that particular front. To that extent, we would say it's not obviously true. In fact, what we're doing is aggressively sexualizing what isn't innately sexual. To that extent, we are bringing out the very feelings of vulnerability, bringing out the very feelings of uncomfortability that men are essentially evoked in women right now. So to that extent, understand where this imbalance in sexuality has to to pervade within the status quo. Second, she says we already sexualize men, to which we say realization already happens for both fronts. Men and women both can be Baywatch models. But the question is, why do all female spaces have to be considered privy to sexualization, while men can ultimately have a dictate over which spaces they want to make sexual and non-sexual? Third, they said the problem is you're making liberation in tandem with men. You're making liberation of women pegged on men. This sounds nice rhetorically, but even leader of the opposition sounded and contended that it's important for women to be able to assert themselves in a space where men unfortunately have power. So in as much as we want rhetorically to make the liberation of women not in tandem with men, we'd say realistically and pragmatically, it has to be done because of the power structure in society. Fourth, they talked about the media. It's great that they talked about the media because we'd like to think we are using the media as well to the for the government bench. So to the extent they talked about the media's influence in being able to shape the body politic, we'd like to use that with regard to government bench as well. But a comparative which opening opposition didn't launch is this. To the extent that the media already sexualizes women and already has a monopoly over that sexualization, why are they fine with allowing that monopoly to pervade without any direct challenge to that hegemony, without any direct challenge to that message? Last, they said men are going to hijack this narrative and they're going to result in victim blaming. That's not our model. That's obviously status quo, and we'd suggest we are actually the ones challenging that. More on that later. So I'm going to be arguing two things in extension. First, I'll look at making the political personal, which we suggest is the greatest front that we want to be able to bring about with regard to gender inequality, because we already have lots of rights, lots of liberties, but it's a question on proving that all spaces are gendered. And second, I'll talk about infighting, but for that, I'll take a POI from closing.
In the real world, how do you expect for there to be humiliating sexualization models when men are in positions of power, control boardrooms and other women on the ground, who are the primary consumers and also men, primarily want to see models like me with six packs.
But that's what's great. That's what's great about the sexual space. It doesn't have to be privy to those positions of power. It's blind to those positions of power precisely because the current hegemony over that discourse says that when you are sexualized, you are rendered vulnerable, naked. The very concept of word naked are proof it exposes. So when Obama was reduced to his glistening pecs, we didn't care that he was the most powerful man in the world, but we thought that there was a certain vulnerability to that. So to that extent, we suggest it's great. First, let's talk about the control over identity. We'd say right now, men have the perfect ability to divorce their sexual identity from their non-sexual one. I'm a president, take me seriously, don't sexualize me. And it's mostly born out of an inequality in discourse. Men can sexualize all women, but they get to choose when they want to get sexualized. This is where aggressive sexualization comes in. We're making all spaces where men pervade spaces that are potentially sexual. There are two benefits to this. First, we are making the political personal. We would say that we want to express difficulty in status quo in dictating that the world is structured in a very much gendered way. Because men now hide between so many euphemisms that make this fight against gender inequality difficult. With regard to politics, men hide behind the euphemism. With regard to how leaders are chosen, they hide behind the euphemism than others. The linguistness of that. To say that certain spaces are not gendered, to say that certain spaces are not privy to that gendered way by which the world is constructed. Because what we are saying is, if Amal Alamuddin does not have control over how she projects herself versus Obama, then we are revealing the very hypocrisy in that and saying that the very way that the politics are structured are essentially personal. Second, this also deals with the infighting with regard to women as well. Again, unlike opening debate, we'd like not to take a blanket stance against sexualization and say that it's either too bad or it's either too good. But what we would suggest coming from closing government is that to the extent that sexualization can be good or bad, it's not a matter of whether or not it's in absolutes, but it's a question on how the individual makes the decision about whether or not he or she is sexualized in the first place. And to that extent, that hegemony is most problematic. The homogeneity is most problematic. To the extent that when you homogeneously treat women as a space which can be easily sexualized, then the women who do want to be sexualized see themselves as being unfairly treated by everyone else who wants to be seen as intelligent, who wants to be seen as too smart. And to that extent, that infighting breeds the inability to be able to fight against gender inequality. Because we brought to you the real debate about aggressive sexualization. It's not about the exact form, but the spaces we're bringing it to, and the real notion of the struggle against gender inequality. We're extremely proud to win. Thank you.
The government member and invite the opposition member to commence the closing opposition case. Here.
Oh God, it's recorded. Will this impact? No. Shut up.
Side government tried to paint a benevolent advertisement campaign which will humiliate and harm men and empower women in the long run. In the real world, there are two things which have remained static for the past century, if not millennia, that men have controlled the structures and power and are the biggest producers of all items, advertisements, and social structures. And at the same time, historically speaking, men are the one who predefine gender roles through running more masculine activities in comparison to women who are forced to stay at home. In that world, a world in which those monopolistic structures are still controlled by men, any form of empowerment which comes out of it will disempower women even more. Our extension will be divided into two parts. One, these structures which are still in the hands of men will produce evil campaigns, not campaigns towards men, but which will hurt women even more and empower men even more. But secondly, we'll be the first one in this debate to say that even if you are to lose that debate, it is that objectification campaign of yours to hurt young boys who do not have six packs like me, to hurt sexual minorities, ladies and gentlemen, who are forced to conform to heterosexual narratives, and also racial minorities who do not look that good like James Bond. we think we will be the first one to talk about that. First, how does the world really look like? Two constants. One, sexualization is produced by gender roles which have been traditionally normative and been there since time immemorial. Look at the history of the division of labor. The reason why under status quo, we generally love seeing men with big abs and like six abs and six packs and also like really big like muscles is because of that history of that gender role and the division labor which assigns and associate power to them. Which means side government cannot merely say, oh no, we can challenge, we can just change it and we can make it out. No. You cannot make out history which has been there since time immemorial. Secondly, forget history. Let's talk about who produces the sexualization campaign. Both opening government say it, but guys, we will have a feminist campaign of forcing men to wear pink. Closing government, just extend a little bit more by saying we need to have safe spaces in which now even men will be discriminated in those spaces. Who control those spaces and what will actually come about of those safe spaces? Two. One, the vast majority of individuals who control that production campaign are white, heteronormative, dominant male who conform to a social stereotypes, which means they don't want no freaking pink outfit which disempowers them. They want suits which make them look good because they wear suits. They want to be the trendsetters. In the real world, your policy will not work. Secondly, even if you are to a seat, magically, suddenly all men like Donald Trump can wear pink. That'll be an odd world, is it? But if that really happens, dude, that world or the campaign which we talked about will not gain social outreach because consumers on the ground like me and you who love to wear suits, but the vast majority do, will not buy into that world because the structures which have been placed there, which means not only are you beholden towards the power structures which are controlled by men, but you're also beholden towards the consumer structures which are also beholden by men. But even if they're beholden by women, the vast majority of women, I'm very sorry, in the real world, prefer a man who looks good, who has six packs, who has big arms. Again, I want to say like me, hopefully you will vote for me. So, what is the conclusion here? What are the harms in this debate? Three harms in particular. One, you will racialize the beauty, the standard of beauty which exists in the status quo. Notice that the vast majority of people at the top are individuals who are white, heteronormative adults. That's why if you look at the crocodile advertisement, only one African American had become the model, others were all freaking white, which means that the standard of beauty is now racialized because the more you empower the standard of beauty by discriminating men, the more you empower white while discriminating the black. Secondly, you also have sexual minorities because now you paint a picture that in order for you to conform to become a good man, to become heterosexual, you must be good. Oh, bullshit. That's just wrong. And any system of empowerment will hit that. But let's say you're best skin, let's assume you flip it. Oh no, you must be soft. The point is, people who are either buff or soft will lose out in that world. That's why we should move away from having that world to begin with. But thirdly, it is odd that CG says, oh good, let's humiliate them. Fine, humiliating adults like me is cool. Imagine a 13-year-old kid that's about to commit suicide because he doesn't look good, discriminated at school because he doesn't wear the right outfit, doesn't look good, doesn't have muscles. That kid might commit suicide. And that's the level of humiliating treatment that you want me to put that person to. I will nuance this. I know discrimination also exists against women, but your policy empowers men even more and the structures of power even more, which means that discrimination against women will not stop, but will be far worse in your world. What is the comparative in this debate? Two things. Let's take their best case scenario. Even if, ladies and gentlemen, these are really good, benevolent, benign campaigns, you will need to challenge the power structures which are controlled by men, corporations, customers, and social trendsetters. Even if it has happened, it will take centuries, if not a millennia. In an exceptionally long time, millions, if not billions of people will suffer because that timeline is ridiculously long. But secondly, even if it takes place in 10 years, you sacrifice racial minorities, sexual minorities, people who are not like, I shouldn't keep on saying, people like Mubarak as battering rams to save women at the expense of all other groups. That is an infinitely worse world. Saving women, hurting Mubarak, I do not want that. Opening.
Majority institutions, as you said, are controlled by men, and yes, we agree. But in the scenario where you allow this to exist without a counter-narrative, does this not get worse for women with moderate?
Any counter-narrative used by the systemic structures will inherently benefit men. What is the comparative? The comparative is to disempower any narrative created by those institutions. And this is the comparative here. Under status quo, even though sexualization exists, sexualization is still frowned upon, even though it's still there. Notice how in a lot of Western liberal democracies, already there are massive campaigns to like jeer individuals who slut shame women. Notice how even in a lot of traditionally dominant, like if you want to become a flight stewardess, you can already be of any size, like in corporations like KLM, if I'm not mistaken. This means that the push is there. What drives that push is when I, regardless of my belief, can say that I feel guilty of sexualizing another person. You normalize moving that sense of moral consciousness by saying that I should not feel guilty, that this is a legitimate tactic for me to use. Mr. Speaker, as a man, even if I can identify as women, I do not give a shit. This policy has men, women, children, sexual minorities, racial minorities, every single person in this room. I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank the member of opposition and invite the government whip to conclude the government bench. Here, here.
We agree that in this society, a lot of men control a lot of structures. But this debate is not about the feasibility of the model. This debate is about how we can question the structures that you want to continue to be strong in your society. Because we need to realize, ladies and gentlemen, that the first thing we need to look at is that we don't care if it takes a long time, as long as we get to the point that it's all right to sue, like, hurt other men in the process, especially when it comes to empowering other people in the long run. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the question is, how do we hurt those power structures? Because under your model, you don't get to hurt those power structures at all. The comparative that the member of opposition gave was, you try to disempower them. But the question is how? Because if you characterize that these structures in themselves are so strong and that there's no way for women to counter those kinds of structures, the only question is, what kind of hurting will it take these structures to fall down? And we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is where Leo's characterization is particularly important, because the only time that you make the people who feel as if they're so strong is that you actually get to ridicule them or try to make them feel vulnerable as well. Because mind you, not every guy feels so empowered with a dad bod. We think, ladies and gentlemen, every other person also has insecurities. That's why this entire concept of people will not buy into it, because men or women also have preferences in the kinds of men they date or the appearance of the men that they date. It's a perfect concession to what we're trying to point out, that women also have preferences, and that these very preferences of women also affect the way that men view themselves in the process. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that this issue is not about racializing individuals, because we don't have to defend a model where the white majority takes all of it. In fact, we're going to perfectly defend a model where individuals, or both the majority and the minority, are sexualized. In fact, if you do this, it becomes clearer what the extent of sexualization is, especially for individuals on the ground. Those are the kinds of ramifications that people will feel for you to be able to recognize that it's okay now to try to empower other women. But most importantly, we need to question that it's okay. We need to question this concept of it being unjust, because one, it's not fair to be able to say that it's unjust to do this to them, particularly because they're men. Because you need to realize, ladies and gentlemen, that the fact that you don't do anything about it makes you complicit to the crimes and complicit to the oppression that you do to other women in the process. But more importantly, the worst case on our side is we try to disempower these men, right? Or the future generations. But we're perfectly okay with that, because these individuals or these men, under your characterization, can take the brunt of those kinds of discriminations at best. But more importantly, they empower at the expense of women feeling disempowered. So even if this is going to be about justification, we're perfectly fine with disempowering individuals if it means that we get to level the playing field for other people as well. What am I going to talk about? No, after my first issue. All right, we're going to talk about
One question: does the aggressive sexualization of men help the cause of women in their fight for equality? And this entire premise coming from the opening opposition, which is that, well, men just feel like they're running up to their body and women feel ashamed. The premise is this: is that media's portrayal of men comes at the point of comfort, which by the way is already status quo, and which by the way is what we're trying to not have, right? We think, ladies and gentlemen, this is not true, because men want to look nice too, and that they're proud. This entire concept of, well, they're proud of their bodies also happens with women, right? So it's not fair to say that women don't feel proud of their bodies, because a lot of fat people are posting, oh, I'm beautiful regardless if I'm fat. A lot of fat women are posting those kinds of pictures online. But this debate doesn't happen on people who already feel empowered with the kinds of sexuality that they have. This debate happens with individuals who don't feel empowered, especially when you show them 36 C cups of breast, ladies and gentlemen. We think that those are the individuals you get to target, and not men who are perfectly okay with their dead buds. In fact, we're going to say that a lot of men in your process, which you probably don't see, or it's probably Sadiq does not see, is that the individuals don't feel as if it's okay to have a huge belly. We think, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of men also have insecurities as well. And the moment that you prey on those insecurities, that's the perfect time for you to say that it's all right and that people understand these kinds of concepts. Because even if it's true, what we're going to do is that we remove this unilateral ability of men to control the perceptions of themselves. And this is what the quote unquote of value of helplessness that they get to feel. The moment that you make them uncomfortable. That's why under Leo's extension, when the president of the United States became uncomfortable of those kinds of premises, we realized it's possible for people to feel as if it's different how you're being sexualized compared to how you treat and work in that society. But more importantly, let's look at this clear concept of, well, media tries to depict them anyway. That's perfectly good. Let's assume the best case of our side and say that media can portray these models as well. What we're doing is that we're making all spaces sexual, because the reason why leader of opposition said that you don't have standards particularly is because those standards don't exist yet, because there is a concept of it's so novel to hypersexualize men. That's what they're changing, right? We're hypersexualizing men, so they realize it's perfectly not okay to do that to other individuals as well. But sure,
Given that you want to focus on comfort and vulnerability, how does this translation happen when it's attached to aggressive sexualization and disproportionate position of power? You can't just react this and not deal with it.
Oh, okay. This is a perfect segue to my second issue on how we conflate this concept of how we fight for equality. We're going to argue that sexual equality is the base and foundation of all other efforts to gain political agenda in the future. That's why we argue about gender body politics. How even when, for example, the moment you are viewed as a sexual object, all your political rights and all your ability to lobby for those particular rights are also hampered in the process. So it becomes significantly hard for you to fight for them. So the moment that we equal this playing field, it's particularly easier for you to fight for your political rights as well, right? But we need to realize, ladies and gentlemen, this particular thing that Sadiq did not respond to was that how women fight against themselves, ladies and gentlemen, particularly because of this concept that they're sexualized. When women antagonize the concept of sexualization too much, they also antagonize the women who are particularly liberal and particularly empowered with the kinds of clothes that they dress. That's why, for example, a lot of corporate women hate the women who are just wearing bras in public, particularly because they feel as if there's a standard against them. If men realize that the same standard is applied on them, we think that it's going to be easier for women to accept themselves and to accept the minorities in their own fight, particularly making it easier to lobby for their causes as a whole. And that's particularly important, especially if we want to talk about gender equality, where individuals are already disempowered. We want to be able to make these women empowered, understand that even, for example, their concept of weaknesses, and even, for example, the concept of unacceptable should be changed in society. The only way to do that is to accept government side. Thank you.
Thank the member of government and the government whip, and invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate. Here. Okay.
Even inside government's best case scenario, there are additional victims at play. We're talking about little boys, we're talking about sexual minorities and racial minorities. When GovWhip dismisses that by saying we will take it for the sake of equality, that's not biting a bullet. That's a missile coming at them. I want to talk about two things. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, why in the best case scenario, they will still lose on a trade-off. Second, why is it that they're less likely to get change? Before that, I want to talk about this last mini extension that they had, which was that women who want to be sexualized will be benefited under their model, which was largely completely inconsistent with the rest of the characterization coming from the entire government, talking about why sexualization in general is just horrible for a woman, for all women, and they want to eventually stop that form of sexualization by making men do it by showing how it's ridiculous. But the second thing is, they also don't deal with the idea that the form of sexualization that empowers women are not controlled by women under their model, but are set for them by the men within those industries. Couple of things. First, best case scenario. No, you're already out. First, let's talk about gender neutral. Let's talk about like gender neutrality that OG wants to talk about, and talked about by CG as well. So first of all, we must understand that new victims are created. Even in their best case scenario where sexualization can take multiple forms, every time you sexualize anyone, it always necessarily creates people who can't opt into that particular form of sexualization, right? Even in those situations, there will always be some minorities, some sexual minorities, some races, some little kids who are not masculine enough, whatever it is, that don't fit in. What is the harm then? We are not therefore reducing the victim, even in the best case, where it takes centuries to go ahead and solve those situations. For those centuries, ladies and gentlemen, we are adding victims, not reducing them. We are talking about little boys who also now feel anorexic, who also now become anorexic. We're also talking about now bullying and slut shaming of boys, for example. That's the best case scenario, right? Even in those situations, we don't think that's an objective good. Even if, and I'm going to bite the bullet, even if it leads to your change, this is not fair. Because first of all, ladies and gentlemen, those are not individuals that had anything to do with the kinds of sexualization and objectification of women that happens within society. They're victims of that as well. These are not individuals who had anything to say with that, and we think it's unfair to use them as social battering rams. Second, the benefit you say is speculative compared to the necessary harm that happens to the people who are left out within that particular process. CEO will take that debate even in the worst case scenario of government proving us out, right? So we would like to then go ahead and talk about, even if you don't buy that, which you should, we would argue why they don't change anything and in fact reverse the positive changes that have happened, right? So side closing government comes up and says, we would like men to feel vulnerable. My first response is this: the experience of sexualization are fundamentally different for men and women. While yes, if you are left out of that particular dominant sexual group, you can be vulnerable, so can women. But a couple of things. When men are praised for their sexualization, that is never bad. The difference here is this. Imagine this. If I say to a girl, you have big boobs, that can be seen as very predatorial. That can often also make women feel uncomfortable and vulnerable. But when you call someone and say to someone, you have six packs, like you look good, that is never predatorial. That empowers that particular man. Therefore, the process of sexualization in itself, ladies and gentlemen, empowers men more than women, right? We think that's very nuanced analysis there. But second, ladies and gentlemen, even if the people who you feel are vulnerable because they're left out of the process of sexualization, those are not people within power anyway, right? Because we are talking about individuals. And this is something, right? Closing government says, oh, but guys, this is not about the feasibility. Like when we discuss emotion, guys, we have to talk about the real life impacts of the particular policy in real life society. But first of all, we would argue that given that men are in power within these kinds of organizations, often control the narratives that are created within this media. That means they have all the incentives to make sure that straight white men are eventually the ones who are seen as the dominant sexual being that you should be. We think that's quite bad, but we would argue that this also then adds on to the other effect, right? We also told you that you must also cater to society, and that means that even if the woman in power often turns out, if you want to sell your products, etc., you end up sexualizing men the way that society wants you to sexualize, and that is why even in your best case scenario, you don't win. But even if these men want to go ahead and change society, people who are left out of that process of sexualization, these are not men who are in power. These are men who are sexual minorities. These are men, the ones who feel vulnerable, are sexual minorities, are racial minorities. These are not individuals who have the ability to go ahead and bring forth that change. But we would also question whether or not they would even want to bring forth that change once they feel like they're also victims and you as women are the perpetrators as well. In that particular situation, the vast majority of instances, people are more likely to lash out as opposed to say, no, I will be nice to you as well because I finally understand. That's not how conflicting wars happen, right? Oh, you discriminate against me, I'll be nice to you because I also know now how to feel discriminated, right? That doesn't happen. People go ahead and often lash out. That's bad. But what did we tell you here? We told you the comparative is this. A lot of progress has happened. First of all, we would argue that things such as slut walks, for example, to go ahead and fight against slut shaming has happened to a large extent. We are also talking about the process where we make people feel guilty because of the privilege that they have, which is the pivotal point through which we make change happen by proving to men in power that their privilege is what needs to change. What does this mean? This means that the point at which you take out that privilege, there's a false equivalency where men feel like they are no longer privileged and they no longer have to feel guilty about that. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it becomes justified in their minds to have silent forms of discrimination against women because they will say, oh, I feel sexualized too. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, that is where the problem comes in, where men feel they no longer have an obligation to create the opportunities against sexualization for men. We would argue that that's quite horrible. So even if the best case scenario, they're able to go ahead and change everything by advertising and everything, they still haven't, by the way, responded to the argument that society would not accept your alternate forms of sexualization of men anyway, and that it would mean that all the forms of sexualization you talk about is also therefore not given the narrative that you would want people to see. The truth is they're going to end up making lives much worse for women, stopping the progress that feminism has had in all these countries for so long. But even in their best case scenario, they still leave out little boys, they still leave out racial minorities and sexual minorities who can never conform to the unfair standards that are going to be set by these industries on men and women. For all those reasons, you must oppose.
Thanks everyone for a great debate. Cross the floor, shake hands, leave the room. Audience members probably leave the room too so we can talk in peace. Thanks for coming. I feel I've learned a lot more about sizes. Is the thing still recording? You just turn it off so they can't hear us.
Nice stream.